Welcome back. The Commission for Gender Equality conducted a study in 3 universities in the country on sexual harassment at the higher education institutions. The report highlighted key factors contributing to this crisis, including alcohol abuse and the struggle to resolve conflicts in a non-violent manner. Nelson Mandela University reported 198 misconduct complaints over the span of 20 months, which includes 31 cases of rape. The Solplaatje University and the Northwest University have also experienced distressing incidents. To discuss this issue and the role of student leadership in fighting GBV, we are now joined by Asive Dlanjwa, who is from the South African Union of Students. Asive, a very good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning. Some would say that the report and its findings come as absolutely no surprise, as some of these cases are cases that have been reported before of gender-based violence that gets experienced, sometimes not even just by the students, by the academic staff as well in some of these universities.
Good morning, Aldrin, to you and your viewers and your listeners, and thank you for having us. Look, you're absolutely correct. Regrettably, there has been a scourge of gender-based violence and generally just violence in institutions of higher learning. Now, we understand that obviously also institutions are microcosms of society, so they are not islands unto themselves. So whatever is prevalent in society will also find expression almost in the very same manner in institutions of higher learning. In fact, a police report a few years back suggested that about 10% of all gender-based violence cases had been happening within institutions, in or around institutions of higher learning. Now, that is obviously an alarming number, and this is gender-based violence cases across of the entire country, and 10% of them are concentrated within that small population of students. So there has been a huge scourge in institutions of higher learning. And you are correct, although the majority of the victims and survivors have regrettably been students, yes, there has been isolated cases where it has been staff and academic staff. But the reality is that our students remain under perpetual threat as it pertains to gender-based violence in institutions of higher learning.
Yeah, and the students being victims of other students as well.
Yes, in fact, the majority of the cases, it's where it's student-on-student violence. That's the majority of the cases. I mean, we're not suggesting that it is lecturer to students. No. The majority of students of those is students to student, and some of them even the communities around those student communities. Because obviously, as I've said, institutions don't exist in a vacuum or in an island. You will remember cases, for instance, of Uinene, etc., where it were the people in and around the community. But I think the point is that exactly as it transpires in society, where it's intimate partners, it's family, it's friends, it's the community. That's exactly the case with institutions of higher learning. The patterns are no different.
Yeah, and for me also interesting is that what this report confirms, and what your experience and some of the cases that you have dealt with also confirms, is that gender-based violence doesn't care if you're rich or if you're poor. It doesn't care if you're black or you're white. It doesn't care if you're male or you're female sometimes, even in certain cases. So how do we address that particular part, and what does it tell us? Because if these are cases, especially if you look at the student to student, or even sometimes academic staff to student victimization or violations that have taken place, we're speaking here about people with a higher level of intellectual capacity. So gender-based violence even happens in cases where you have somebody who could be the smartest in the class.
Yes, Aldrin, and really it shows you how ruthless generally the scourge and the pandemic of gender-based violence is. I think the president was correct, I think in 2020 to declare it, or 2021, a pandemic itself. So it is not a respecter of persons, regrettably. So look, what should be done as gruesome as the scourge has been, we do not believe that we have enough efforts have been done to deal with it. I think for the most part, we have been paying lip service to the fight against gender-based violence. I will give you institutions, for instance, as an example, why I'm saying this. So all institutions are supposed to have a gender-based violence policy that has protocols and guidelines that one will deal in terms of being a preventative tool for gender-based violence, but also to deal and to process gender-based violence cases, etc. And the reality is that the majority of the institutions do not have those policies. In fact, the study that you referred to in your opening also revealed that some institutions did not have this policy. This is a policy that was developed in 2019 and that all institutions were disseminated to all institutions that they were supposed to have implemented up until today. It is a very critical tool, Adrian, because one, it has tools inculcated within it to be able to detect gender-based violence, but also to be able to empower students to be able to know what is gender-based violence, how to protect themselves, and how to protect their communities. And up until today, institutions have not implemented that. One of the things it also speaks to is a dedicated gender-based violence unit that will investigate and that will process GBV cases in institutions of higher learning, and that up until today has not been done. So there are many things that have not been done by institutions to demonstrate their will and willingness really to deal with gender-based violence. So the fight that we are losing in institutions of higher learning is not because, the fight is so greater than us. There has been no commitment and no investment. One of the other proposals that we put on the table was that there must be a dedicated foundational module that students do when they get into institutions that is compulsory for all students, specifically for GBV, to capacitate them as to understand what is GBV, because we have a misconception. We assume that because they're in institutions of higher learning, they know what GBV is, they know how to protect themselves, they know how to do, but that's not the reality. The numbers are not telling us that. That has not been done up until today. And now, if you give me time, I'll also tell even of our proposal that we gave to the department and to government as to how do we deal with gender-based violence. So more than anything, really, it's not a question of is the fight too big for us as much as it's a question of there's just no commitment and willingness to invest in the fight against gender-based violence.
Hey, listen, man, it has taken even the judiciary years to come up with a sexual harassment policy or anti-sexual harassment policy for the judges. But I want to conclude the conversation on this particular one. So in the article, in News 24 article, they spoke to Dr. Ruby Ann Levendel, who is the Director for Transformation at the Nelson Mandela University. And the point that she stresses is when it comes to off-campus incidents that have taken place, they can't do anything about it because it is considered to be double jeopardy. What's your understanding around this? And is this fair? Also considering, of course, that some of these off-campus residents, you have this issue of they are receiving accreditation from NSFAS, and the fear is that if they do escalate these reports that are coming from victims of gender-based violence, they could lose that accreditation.
Look, absolute hogwash. There is no such a thing that institutions would not be able to enforce and would not be able to deal with the gender-based violence as it pertains to students that are living in off-campus student accommodation, because the reason why we asked in 2019 that all student accommodation should be accredited was so that it meets certain standards and certain norms, especially as it pertains to the safety of students. So meaning that the institution has direct responsibility over the student who are in those accommodations which are accredited by those institutions. So institutions do not have a problem receiving funds and monies from those accredited institutions and to accredit them, but they have a problem in terms of extending their hand to ensure that those students whom are in the in those accommodations whereby those institutions are deriving profit, that suddenly institutions no longer have a capacity to deal with that. So that's absolute nonsense. It does not exist, and it should be condemned. The other thing which you had said was that we needed an interdisciplinary team between a government, between SEPs, and between institutions of higher learning through their protection services. We had asked for a dedicated SEPs unit around all institutions of higher learning. And Aldrin, what we are requesting is not absurd, because during the Fees Must Fall, the government had a dedicated unit from the police service all the way from national that was meant to detect where there could be protests in institutions of higher learning and where they could arrest students. We are asking for the same investment in resources of having that dedicated unit that will deal with GBV and student safety, that will be interdisciplinary between police stations around institutions of higher learning, the protection services and institutions, and those student accommodation. So it's not a difficult issue, as I'm saying to you, but that comment from the doctor, which I'm not hearing for the first time, it represents the attitude of institutions as it pertains to this fight. They are uncaring and they are disdain for the fight which we are engaged in.